What's going on, guys? It's David here, and today I wanted to take some time to talk about a topic that might be a little bit controversial. And before I hop into this topic, I do definitely want to say thank you to everybody that's watched the video from a couple days ago. It's been crazy to see the reaction. I've never had a video on this channel hit that many views. It's just beyond my wildest sort of dreams, I guess you could say. Subscriber count shot up as well. So thank you guys for just being interested in the topics that I've been sharing. I do definitely like to keep things on the product tips review side of things, but in efforts to continue the conversation that we're having, I thought we would travel over and continue to talk about cheaters in the world of CrossFit. Now, again, I do definitely want to say that I am not a scientist. I am not a doctor. I do not have any credentials that would indicate that you should 100% take my advice in regards to steroids usage. I don't think that my views are my own views, and this is purely educational. This is purely for the conversation. This is not to encourage anybody to take steroids. This is not to encourage anybody to not take steroids. You, as a grown adult, should make the decision of whether or not you will decide to take steroids. But I think for the interest, for those of us who are interested in the world of CrossFit, it's a topic that I feel like a lot of the times we deny, and it's a topic that a lot of the times we don't admit to, because we are so proud and we are so built up on this idea that we as CrossFitters, or the sport of CrossFit, breeds the fittest human beings in the entire world. And in most regards, I want to say that I do definitely believe that CrossFit is probably one of the best strength and conditioning regimens that the general population can subscribe to. I am a practitioner of CrossFit myself. I love it. I've drank the Kool-Aid. I love the athletes that put in the hard work. So anything that is stated in this conversation that we are having now is not stated out of hate or frustration or malice towards anybody. It's purely for having the conversation. But at the same time, we cannot deny the fact that yes, there are a lot of athletes that compete that don't take CrossFit, but we also have to admit that there are a lot of athletes that do most likely take some sort of performance enhancing drug. And I think that if there was any performance enhancing drug that an athlete would be inclined to take, it would most likely be EPO. I kind of had briefly this conversation with somebody at my gym in regards to, these athletes are crazy. They've won, Matt Fraser has won 4 years in a row. It's far-fetched to think that there is nothing that he could be possibly taking. And if he was taking anything, again, it would most likely be EPO. And if you're thinking to yourself that you might have heard the word EPO, well, you probably have heard of EPO before, because EPO was the drug that Lance Armstrong and the cyclists were taking at that time, and probably are still taking, in order to increase red blood cells in their body, as well as increase VO2 max, and just increase time to exhaustion. So they were able to just improve their overall performance over time, and that's why it seemed like they were unbeatable. Also, one of the biggest characteristics behind EPO was that it was a drug that very greatly benefited endurance athletes. So people who probably more often than not would be a lot slimmer, would be involved in sports like long distance running, cycling, anything that would essentially be would require high amounts of endurance. Now, I know that's not the scientific explanation behind EPO. I'll leave some videos down below where you can see more in depth in regards to what exactly EPO does, as well as some tests that scientists have run that prove or show the efficacy of EPO. Now, one of the reasons why EPO was such a we could say party drug for lack of a better term, was because of the fact that most of these athletes were microdosing, which means most of these athletes were taking or were using EPO, and they were using it to their advantage through microdosing. And so usually they would take it at night. They would have an increase of red blood cells by the morning. The effect or the drug would be broken down within their body, and it would be masked. So if there were tests that they needed to take, those tests would not be able to detect EPO. Now, the interesting thing about EPO is that in studies that have been undertaken, they've seen huge increases of VO2 maxes, upwards to 27% increases. So as far as an endurance athlete, if they were going to be taking any drug, EPO essentially would be the drug of choice, because it would be almost essentially a direct increase in performance to whatever sport it was that they were doing. There's also football players, I believe, that take EPO, lots of different types of athletes that take EPO. Now, for people like bodybuilders or people like weightlifters, there's no real benefit to taking EPO, because most of the time they're not doing huge sets of reps, like CrossFit, for example. They're not doing 10 sets of any particular movement for any particular given time. Usually you'll hit a set, maybe it might be a complex, but you'll hit a set and then you'll probably wait 2 to 3 minutes to rest and recover. EPO would allow you to just work more over time. It would decrease the amount of time that you would need to recover. So again, if you're doing things like running, long distance running or cycling, this would be perfect, because you're riding your bike for miles and 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 miles, and you need a way to defer the amount of time that it takes you to become exhausted, as well as continue to output more power. So you're continuing to intake this oxygen into your bloodstream. It's a crazy drug. It's an interesting drug. If you again also want to see more about this, I would definitely recommend checking out the movie Icarus, which also goes into detail on this dude's journey of becoming a cyclist and using EPO, blood doping, working with the WADA facilities that essentially were people that worked at these facilities. Crazy story. Definitely recommend. It's on Netflix. Please go watch that, because it definitely gives you insight into the lives of these high-level athletes, as well as the lengths of risks that they would take in order to win competition. Now, the reason why I say that EPO would probably be a drug of choice for CrossFit athletes, let's take, for example, somebody like Matt Frazier, who initially, when he started CrossFit, had more of a weightlifting bias, strength bias, and so things like endurance weren't really his strong suit. Now, over time, obviously, he would want to focus on dialing down his cardiovascular system, his aerobic capacity. So we can see that very clearly in a lot of the different aerobic capacity dependent workouts that took place in the game earlier on in his career, and he didn't do too well in those events. Over time, the last couple of years, he's dominated. He's done an amazing job in terms of turning that ship around and really making improvements to improving his aerobic capacity. And that's where I think the possibility of EPO could play a factor in that. I'm not saying he's done it, but it would be definitely a favorable drug of choice if he was going to do something like that, because he would see direct impacts of the EPO and the increased red blood cells in his training. He would be able to utilize this pretty much right off the get-go, and within, let's say, for example, 10 weeks, he would see vast strides of improvement in regards to his ability to have increased endurance, increased power output in these long distance endurance events. And given the fact that he's not training to have a super strong bias in weightlifting, he wants to be as balanced as possible. He's most likely not going to be carrying the same body composition that he would if he was a weightlifter, which again, weightlifters don't use EPO. Strength athletes don't use EPO. There's no real reason for them. Again, it's endurance athletes that are the ones that are using EPO. Now, typically, if an athlete is blood doping, there's no real way for these tests that are administered to tell if there's any possible way for them to. There's really no way for them to tell what these athletes have done. So that's why another reason why blood doping is such a popular thing, because it's a way to directly see the performance gains of an athlete without really risking a whole bunch outside of removing blood and putting it back in, making sure that the blood is stored right, taken care of in that regards is also another element of that. But as long as that's taken care of, blood doping is almost like a easy thing to do. It's a thing that can't really be traced to any specific drug for that matter. Now, there are things that, tiny minute things that they can test for that are indirect, and those would be plastics that would be introduced in the bloodstream as byproducts of the bags that they're stored in, but they would essentially need to test for those specifically in order to tell whether or not somebody had done blood doping. Now, according to CrossFit's drug testing policy at the moment, they do urine sample testings, microdosing EPO. There's a high chance, or microdosing blood doping, there's a high chance that they could be bypassing these tests because they're not administered regularly. They're random drug tests throughout the year. Yes, they're in this drug testing pool, but who knows when they're going to get tested. So CrossFit isn't really monitoring at what parts of the year, what each individual athlete's blood markers are at. Now, if CrossFit really wanted to dial down and ensure that athletes weren't doping, especially using something like EPO to increase performance, they would need to use biological passports, which I believe the Olympic weightlifting committee uses for athletes within Olympic weightlifting, but that's not something that's used within CrossFit. And so that's where I think that if an athlete was to be using some sort of drug, I think the only logical, or the only easy to use drug that you could pass a drug test would most likely be EPO. I know this is a very short piece in regards to EPO usage, drugs, steroid usage. I still am learning a lot about drug usage and steroid usage. I don't know everything. I'm just going to be frank and honest with you guys. But from my initial research, I think if any athlete was going to be taking any drug, it would have to be EPO. EPO would be the only drug that would make sense for an athlete to take. I think that's really what it comes down to. If any CrossFit athlete would be taking any drug that would be worthwhile to any extent, it would have to be EPO. And could Matt Fraser be on EPO? I don't know. Let's discuss that in the comments for this video, guys. I'm going to leave that there. I would love to talk further with you guys in regards to what your guys' thoughts are in regards to this whole controversy of athletes that could potentially be taking drugs or athletes that aren't potentially taking drugs. And at the end of the day, we can't sit here and say that, oh, CrossFit athletes don't take drugs, and we can't be surprised if an athlete does get popped. I think we would be naive to think that there aren't a large majority of, or I won't say majority, but there is not a large population of CrossFit athletes that are taking drugs, in the same way that there are tons of athletes or fitness people at regular 24s that are taking drugs. Let's pull the wool from our eyes and let's be honest. Let's have an honest conversation. I want to chat with you guys. Let's leave those comments down below. What are your thoughts on steroid usage and CrossFit? Let's discuss, let's debate, guys. That's going to be it for this video. It's going to be short, simple, and sweet. I promise you guys I will get back to product reviews and things like that, but I want to continue to have this conversation on cheaters in the world of CrossFit. Again, thank you guys. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to hit that like button and that subscribe button. I'll leave all the links to all the information that I've been looking over in regards to the world of EPO, steroids, CrossFit, things like that. Again, leave your comments down below. Let's talk, let's debate, let's have discussion, guys. As always, may your barbells be heavy and your coffee be black. This is David, and I catch you guys in the next video. Peace.